If there is any truth in the statements that have now been made, the question respecting the obligation of the British covenants is deeply interesting to the present generation. The identity of a nation as existing through different ages is, in all moral respects, as real as the identity of an individual through the whole period of his life. The individuals that compose it, like the particles of matter in the human body, pass away and are succeeded by others. But the body politic continues essentially the same. If Britain contracted a moral obligation in virtue of a solemn national covenant for religion and reformation, that obligation must attach to her until it has been discharged. Have the pledges given by the nation been yet redeemed? Do not the principal stipulations in the covenant remain unfulfilled at this day? Are we not, as a people, still bound by that engagement to see these things done? Has the lapse of time cancelled the bond, or will a change of sentiments and views set us free from its tie? Is it not the duty of all the friends of Reformation to endeavor to keep alive a sense of this obligation on the public mind? But although all ranks and classes in the nation should lose impressions of it, and although there should not be a single religious denomination, nor even a single individual in the land to remind them of it, will it not be held in remembrance by one with whom, quote, 1,000 years are as one day, and one day as 1,000 years, unquote? By this time the reader must be aware of the general opinion which I entertain on the basis, which I entertain of the basis on which the two largest synods of secession have lately united. It is not my intention to enter into any particular examination of the articles of that agreement. Complexly taken, they afford undeniable proof of a complete recession from the ground originally occupied by seceders. The exception made to the Westminster Confession of Faith and Catechisms is expressed in such a way as to leave on them the imputation of teaching persecuting principles in matters of religion, and in such a way as to set aside or to throw loose the whole doctrine which they teach respecting the exercise of magistratical authority about these matters. Besides, the United Synod merely retain these books, as, to use their own words, the confession of our faith expressive of the sense in which we understand the Holy Scriptures, but do not receive them, as was formerly done by the Church of Scotland and in the secession, under the consideration of their being subordinate standards of uniformity for the three nations. The other standards, the Westminster, quote, form of church government and, quote, directory, unquote, are entirely excluded from the basis. The general statement on the head of Presbyterian government is chargeable with ambiguity and, unless inadvertency be pleaded, is evasive. The expression of veneration for our reforming ancestors and of a warm sense of the value of their efforts, quote, in the cause of civil and religious liberty, unquote, I have no doubt is unfeigned. And the approval of the method adopted by them for mutual excitement and encouragement by solemn confederation and vows to God is so far good. But I must be allowed to add that this is saying no more than has been often said by those friends of civil and religious liberty whose system of religion was very opposite to that of our reforming ancestors, and that it is a very poor substitute for that explicit approbation of and adherence to the covenanted reformation of Britain, which seceders formerly avouched. This is all that the United Synod have to say respecting our national covenants. They approve of the method adopted by solemn confederation and vows to God. But they have not a word to say on the present or continued obligation of these vows. For surely it was not expected that the public would consider this as included in the following declaration. We acknowledge that we are under high obligations to maintain and promote the work of reformation begun, and to a great extent carried on by them. Nothing, in fact, could be more disgraceful to these covenants than to attempt to bring them in under the cover of such an expression, and, after the open, decided, express, and repeated avowals of the perpetual obligation of the National Covenant of Scotland and the Solemn League and Covenant of the Three Kingdoms, in the former profession and in the ordination formula of the two bodies now composing the Union, the omission of everything of this kind, and the careful exclusion of the very names of these covenants, can be viewed in no other light than a practical renunciation of their obligation, and a rescinding of all former declarations in favor of it. If the United Synod were the same with the original seceding body, how severely would they condemn themselves by the charge which they once and again brought against the established church after the Revolution, because, quote, they did not by any particular act of assembly assert the obligation of our covenants, national and solemn league, and their binding force upon posterity. And here a footnote. Act Declaration Testimony in Display 190. The Acknowledgement of Sins, page 231. On the provision made by the Articles for the practice of covenanting, I have only to observe that this exercise was all along viewed in that part of the secession by which it was observed as the most solemn mode of sealing the common profession of the whole body, that as such it was engaged in at the express call of the Supreme Judicatory, and that, when the United Synod cannot say that, the circumstances of Providence require it. I can scarcely persuade myself that it is seriously contemplated to practice the sacred service in a manner which would discredit it, and which is totally irreconcilable with Presbyterian principles. And here a footnote. Formerly, secessions were left to determine when the performance of the duty was suitable to the circumstances of their respective congregations, but now they must determine whether Providence is requiring the duty, or in the other words, whether it be at all a duty incumbent on the Church in the present times. With respect to the religious clause in some Burgess oaths, which occasioned the original strife, the preamble to the basis supposes that there are some towns where it may still exist, and all the provision it makes with respect to this is that both synods agree to use what may appear to them the most proper means for obtaining the abolition of it. No provision is made that, if they shall be unsuccessful in their applications for an abolition of it, the oath shall not be taken in the united society, although it is well known that the one of the parties had all along maintained that seceders involved themselves in contradiction by swearing it, and continued down to the time of the Union, to require all entrants to public office among them to declare their solemn approbation of an act condemning it in this point of view. They are thus involved in a judicial allowance of what they hold to be sinful, and have recognized a principle which may be applied to an indefinite extent, and which ought to have been guarded against with the utmost care, as it enters into all the loose plans of communion which are so fashionable in the present day. This is still more evident from the engagement which they have come under, that they shall carefully abstain from agitating in future the questions which occasion the separation. It is proposed that the United Synod shall prepare a testimony containing the substance of the judicial act and testimony, the act concerning the doctrine of grace, and the answers to Nairn's reasons of dissent. What some may understand by the substance, it may be difficult to say. But if the proposed testimony really contain the substance of the first and last named of these papers, the basis will not support the superstructure. In an answer to all this, some will say, we are at full liberty to hold all our principles as formerly. But such persons should remember that the question is not about their principles, but the principles, or rather the public profession, of the body, and that it has been chiefly by means of the latter that the declarative glory of God has been promoted in every age, and his truths and cause preserved and transmitted to posterity. It is painful to me to be obliged to speak in this manner of the terms of a union, which it would have filled my heart with delight to see established on a solid and scriptural foundation. But in such cases there is a duty incumbent on all the friends of the cause of the Reformation and the secession, and this they must discharge, whatever it may cost them, and regardless of the obloquy that they may hereby incur. They are sacredly bound to adhere to that cause, to confess it, and, according to the cause of Providence, to appear openly in its defense. It cannot but be grieving to them to find that the attempt made to heal the breach among its professed friends has discovered that disaffection to it existed to a greater extent than they could have imagined. They may be accused as the enemies of peace and union, but they have this consolation, that they still occupy that ground on which their fathers displayed a faithful testimony for the truths and laws of Christ against prevailing defection, and that they are adhering without any reservation or any mark of dissent to that testimony and to those books of public authority which were formerly agreed on for settling and preserving religious unity and communion on the most extended scale. And they are encouraged to maintain this ground by the hope which they still cherish, that the God of their fathers and of their vows will yet, in his merciful providence, bring round a time of reformation, and that when this period shall have arrived, the Westminster Standards may form a rallying point around which the scattered friends of religion in this land shall meet and happily combine. The end.